The iron collar around her neck gleamed dully in the scorching Wyoming sun, and Beatrice Parker wondered if she would die wearing it like the animal they had made her. She stood in the center of Fort Bridger's dusty Main Street in July of 1872, auctioned off like livestock for the third time in 2 years, her wrists bound with coarse rope that had rubbed her skin raw. The man who had owned her last, a railroad magnate named Thaddeus Crane, had clamped that collar around her throat 6 months ago when she had tried to run, telling her she was property, nothing more. Now Crane was dead from a heart seizure, and his estate was liquidating everything he owned, including the young woman he had purchased from a San Francisco gambling den to settle a debt. Beatrice was 21 years old, though the hardness in her blue eyes made her seem ancient. Her dark auburn hair hung limp and tangled past her shoulders, and the thin cotton dress she wore was stained and torn at the hem. The collar was the worst part, a constant reminder that she had no say in her own life, that men like Crane could do whatever they wanted to women who had no family, no protection, no legal standing. She had been born to a prostitute in Sacramento, who died when Beatrice was 14, leaving her alone in a world that devoured young women without mercy. A crooked saloon owner had claimed she owed him money for her mother's debts, and from there, Beatrice's life had become a series of transactions, each more degrading than the last. The auctioneer, a pot-bellied man with tobacco-stained teeth, rattled off her supposed qualities like she was a mare being sold for breeding. Strong back, good with cooking and cleaning, young enough to bear children. We will start the bidding at $50. Beatrice kept her eyes down, refusing to look at the men gathered around. She had learned that showing defiance only made things worse. But inside, rage burned like a furnace. She would rather die than belong to another man who thought money gave him ownership of her body and soul. $50, called out a merchant with greedy eyes. 60, countered a rancher whose hands looked like they had crushed things before. Beatrice's stomach turned. She calculated her chances of running, but with her wrists bound and the collar marking her as owned property, she would not make it 10 feet before someone dragged her back. The territory had laws about runaways, and those laws were not written to protect women like her. $100. The voice cut through the bidding like a knife through silk, deep and steady and somehow different from the others. The crowd parted, and Beatrice saw him for the first time. He was tall, probably 26 or 27, with sun-weathered skin and dark brown hair that needed cutting. He wore the practical clothes of a working cowboy, dusty denim pants, a chain-brace shirt with the sleeves rolled up, worn leather boots, and a hat that had seen better days. What struck her most were his eyes, a clear hazel that looked directly at her face, not at her body, not at the collar, but at her as though she were actually a person. The auctioneer's eyes lit up with greed. $100 from Ethan Barrett. Do I hear 110? The rancher who had bid 60 shook his head and walked away. The merchant looked angry but stayed silent. $100 was a substantial sum in 1872, more than most cowboys made in 3 months. Going once, going twice, sold to Ethan Barrett for $100. Beatrice felt something inside her break a little more. It did not matter that this man had kind eyes. Men with kind eyes could still be monsters when they got you alone. She had learned that lesson too many times. Ethan stepped forward and counted out the money in gold coins, which the auctioneer snatched eagerly. Then Ethan turned to Beatrice and pulled a knife from his belt. She flinched instinctively, her body tensing for violence, but instead of grabbing her, he carefully cut the ropes binding her wrists. "You are going to bleed if we do not clean those," he said quietly, looking at the raw wounds the rope had left. His voice was surprisingly gentle. Beatrice stared at him, not understanding. Every man who had ever purchased her had immediately established dominance, had made it clear what her purpose was, had taken what they paid for. But Ethan Barrett just stood there, knife in hand, waiting for something she could not name. "Can you walk?" he asked. She nodded mutely, not trusting her voice. "My horse is at the livery. We have a ride ahead of us." As they walked through Fort Bridger's streets, Beatrice was acutely aware of the collar around her neck. It rubbed against her skin with every step, a cold metal circle that proclaimed her status to everyone they passed. Women looked at her with pity or disgust, men with curiosity or contempt. She kept her eyes on the ground, following Ethan's bootsteps in the dust. At the livery stable, he had 2 horses saddled and ready, a large chestnut gelding and a smaller bay mare. He gestured to the bay. "You can ride." "Yes," Beatrice said, her voice hoarse from disuse. Crane had not allowed her to speak unless spoken to. "Good. It is about 15 miles to my ranch. We should make it before dark." He helped her mount, his hands impersonal and efficient, and then swung up onto his own horse. They rode out of Fort Bridger heading northeast, and Beatrice tried to memorize the route in case she needed to run. The Wyoming landscape stretched endlessly in all directions. Rolling hills covered with sagebrush and wild grass, mountains rising in the distance like sentinels. The sky was so vast it made her feel insignificant, but also somehow free in a way she had not felt in years. They rode in silence for over an hour. Beatrice's mind raced with possibilities, each darker than the last. Maybe Ethan Barrett did not want to establish his ownership in public. Maybe he was taking her somewhere isolated where no one would hear her scream. Maybe he was one of those men who like to play gentle before showing his true nature. Finally, as the sun started to sink toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Ethan slowed his horse to a walk. Beatrice did the same, her muscles tense with anxiety. "That collar," Ethan said without looking at her. "Did Crane put that on you?" Beatrice's hand went instinctively to her throat. "Yes." "Does it have a lock?" "No, it is welded shut." Ethan was quiet for a moment and she saw his jaw tighten. "When we get to the ranch, I am going to cut it off. I want you to know that ahead of time, so you are not frightened when I come at you with metal cutters." Beatrice's breath caught in her chest. "Why?" "Because no human being should wear a collar like a dog." His voice was hard with anger, but she sensed it was not directed at her. "Because what Crane did was wrong, and I will not have it on my land." She did not know what to say to that. Every response that came to mind seemed inadequate or dangerous. So she said nothing, and they continued riding as the sun dipped lower and the air grew cooler. Ethan's ranch appeared as they crested a low hill, a modest spread with a sturdy log cabin, a barn, a corral with several horses, and what looked like good grazing land extending toward a creek lined with cottonwood trees. It was not grand, but it looked well maintained and honest, the kind of place built by hard work rather than inherited wealth. They dismounted in front of the barn, and Ethan took both horses to unsaddle and brush down. Beatrice stood awkwardly, not sure what was expected of her. In her previous situations, the rules had been made brutally clear within the first hour. Here, she had no framework to understand what was happening. "You must be hungry," Ethan said as he led the horses into the barn. "There is food in the cabin. Go ahead and eat whatever you want. I will be in shortly." Beatrice walked slowly to the cabin, half expecting a trap. But the door opened easily, and inside she found a single large room with a stone fireplace, a bed in one corner, a table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with supplies, and a small kitchen area with a cast iron stove. It was clean and organized, the home of someone who took care of what they had. She saw only one bed, and her stomach clenched with familiar dread. She found bread, cheese, and dried meat on the shelves, along with a jar of preserved peaches that made her mouth water. She had not eaten since the previous day, and her hands shook as she cut slices of bread and cheese. She was still eating when Ethan came in carrying metal cutters and a small leather pouch. "Let me see that collar," he said, setting the tools on the table. Beatrice stopped chewing, her body going rigid. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. She had learned long ago that running only made the punishment worse. Ethan must have seen the fear in her eyes because he held up his hands, palms out. "I am just going to cut it off. That is all. I promise you I am not going to hurt you." "Men always say that," Beatrice whispered. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something like pain cross his face. "I know, and I know you have no reason to trust me. But I am asking you to let me do this one thing. After that, if you want to leave, I will give you money and a horse and you can go wherever you want. But I need to get that damned collar off your neck." Beatrice did not believe him about letting her leave, but she also knew she had no real choice in the matter. Slowly, she approached him and tilted her chin up, exposing the collar. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Ethan positioned the metal cutters carefully, his hands steady. "This might pinch a little, but I will be as quick as I can. Hold still." The sound of metal shearing through metal was loud in the quiet cabin. Beatrice felt pressure against her throat, uncomfortable but not painful. And then suddenly the collar fell away in two pieces, clattering onto the table. The absence of weight around her neck was so sudden and strange that she gasped, her hand flying to her throat to touch bare skin. "There," Ethan said quietly. He picked up the severed collar with an expression of disgust. "Wait here." He walked outside, and Beatrice stood frozen, her fingers exploring the indentation the collar had left on her skin. She heard the sound of digging, and when she went to the door, she saw Ethan in the fading light, using a shovel to excavate a deep hole near the edge of his property. He dropped the collar pieces into the hole and buried them, packing the earth down firmly, as though he were interring something evil that should never see daylight again. When he came back inside, his hands were dirty and his expression was grim. "That is done. You will never wear anything like that again." Beatrice felt tears prick her eyes, and she turned away quickly, not wanting him to see. She had taught herself not to cry years ago because tears only made men feel more powerful. But the simple act of destroying that collar, of literally burying it deep in the earth, had cracked something in the armor she wore around her heart. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice barely audible. Ethan washed his hands in a bucket of water by the door. "You should finish eating. Then we need to talk about some things." Beatrice returned to the table, but her appetite had vanished. She watched Ethan warily as he sat down across from her, his large frame making the chair look small. He folded his hands on the table and met her eyes directly. "Here is the situation," he said. "I bought you today because I could not stand watching you sold to men who were going to use you badly. I know that does not make me a hero. I still participated in a system that treats human beings like property, and I am not proud of that. But what is done, and now we need to figure out what comes next." Beatrice said nothing, waiting for the other boot to drop. "You can leave if you want," Ethan continued. "I meant what I said. I will give you money and a horse and supplies, and you can go to California or back east, or wherever you think you might have a chance at a decent life. But I am going to be honest with you. A woman alone on the frontier is vulnerable. You know that better than I do. What is the alternative?" Beatrice asked, her voice flat. "You can stay here. I need help running this ranch. It is hard work and I cannot pay much, but you would have a roof over your head, food to eat, and I give you my word that I will never touch you in any way you do not want. You would be an employee, not a slave. Not property. A person working for wages. Beatrice studied his face, looking for the lie. Men always lied about their intentions. But Ethan's hazel eyes were steady and clear, and there was something in the set of his jaw that suggested integrity. She wanted desperately to believe him, but belief was a luxury she could not afford. "What kind of work?" she asked cautiously. "Cooking, washing, mending, helping with the animals when needed. General ranch work. It is not easy, but it is honest. And if I stay, where do I sleep?" Ethan gestured to the bed in the corner. "You take the bed, I will sleep in the barn." "That makes no sense. This is your home. And you are a woman who has been through hell and needs to feel safe. The barn is fine. I have slept in worse places." Beatrice felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest, something that might have been hope if she had not learned to kill that emotion long ago. "How do I know you will not change your mind? How do I know you will not come in here one night and take what you think you paid for?" Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small revolver, which he placed on the table between them. "You keep this under your pillow. If I ever do anything that makes you feel unsafe, you shoot me. I would rather be dead than become the kind of man who forces himself on a woman." Beatrice stared at the gun. It was a test, obviously. No man would give a woman he had just purchased a loaded weapon unless he was trying to prove something. But what if it was not loaded? What if this was all an elaborate game to make her lower her guard? As though reading her mind, Ethan picked up the revolver, opened the cylinder to show her it was fully loaded, then set it back down. "It is real and it is yours. Protection, not a threat." The sun had fully set now and the cabin was growing dark. Ethan stood and lit an oil lamp, casting warm light across the rough-hewn walls. "You do not have to decide tonight. Get some rest. We can talk more in the morning." He grabbed a blanket from a chest and headed for the door. "Bolt this behind me. Do not open it for anyone, including me, unless you feel safe doing so." And then he was gone, leaving Beatrice alone in the cabin with a loaded gun and more questions than answers. She heard his footsteps crossing to the barn, heard the barn door creak open and shut. Then silence, broken only by the sound of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. Beatrice picked up the revolver with shaking hands. It was heavier than she expected, cold and solid and real. She checked the cylinder again, confirming it was loaded, then held it in her lap as she sat in the wooden chair, staring at the bolted door. She did not trust Ethan Barrett, could not trust him, not yet. But he had cut off the collar. He had buried it deep. And that single act had given her something she had not felt in 2 years, the faintest possibility that not all men were monsters. She did not sleep in the bed that night. She sat in the chair with the gun in her lap, watching the door, waiting for him to come back and reveal his true intentions. But the door never opened. The night passed slowly, and as the first gray light of dawn crept through the window, Beatrice finally allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, Ethan Barrett had meant what he said. When full daylight came, Beatrice heard sounds from the barn, the lowing of cattle, the whinny of horses, the general noise of a ranch coming to life. She stood stiffly, her body aching from sitting in the chair all night, and went to the small mirror hanging on the wall. The face that looked back at her was gaunt and hollow-eyed, but the indentation around her neck from the collar was already starting to fade. She touched it gently, marveling again at the absence of that hated weight. A knock on the door made her jump. "Miss Parker." "I am going to leave some water by the door for washing. Take your time. I will be working with the horses if you need anything." Beatrice waited until she heard his footsteps retreat before unbolting the door. Outside sat a bucket of clean water, still cool from the well, and a bar of soap. She brought them inside quickly and bolted the door again, then stripped off the filthy dress she had been wearing and washed herself thoroughly for the first time in weeks. The soap smelled like lye and lavender, harsh but clean. She scrubbed away layers of dirt and degradation, wishing she could wash away memories as easily. She had no other clothes, so she had to put the same dress back on, but at least her skin was clean. She braided her hair to keep it out of her face and tried to make herself presentable. Then she tucked the revolver into the pocket of her dress, feeling its weight against her hip like a promise, and went outside to find Ethan. He was in the corral working with a young horse, patient and gentle, letting the animal come to him rather than forcing compliance. Beatrice watched from the fence, studying him. He moved with confidence but not arrogance, and when the horse finally allowed him to touch its neck, he rewarded it with soft words and a piece of apple from his pocket. "You are good with horses," Beatrice said. Ethan looked up and his face registered surprise that she had come out. "Horses are honest. Treat them right, and they will give you everything they have. Treat them wrong, and they will never trust you. There is something pure about that. Is that why you treat people the same way?" He smiled slightly, the first smile she had seen from him. It transformed his face, making him look younger and less weathered. "I try. Do not always succeed, but I try." Beatrice climbed over the fence and approached slowly the way Ethan had approached the horse. "I have decided to stay. For now. But I need some things to be clear. All right. I do the work you assign and you pay me wages. Real wages that I can save. You do not touch me. You do not come into the cabin without knocking, and if you break any of those rules I leave or I use this." She patted the pocket where the gun rested. "Agreed." Ethan held out his hand. "Do we have a deal?" Beatrice looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment. Shaking hands was what partners did, what equals did. She could not remember the last time someone had offered to shake her hand like she was a real person. Slowly, she reached out and clasped his hand. His grip was warm and calloused and firm without being crushing. "Deal," she said. And so Beatrice Parker began a new life at the Barrett Ranch. The work was hard, just as Ethan had promised. She woke before dawn to start breakfast, spending hours cooking over the wood stove, learning to bake bread in the Dutch oven, preserving vegetables from the small garden behind the cabin. She washed clothes in the creek, scrubbing until her hands were raw, hanging everything to dry on lines strung between cottonwood trees. She mended torn shirts and pants by lamplight, learning to make neat, tiny stitches that would hold under hard use. But it was honest work, and that made all the difference. When Ethan asked her to do something, it was a request, not a command. When she made mistakes, as she often did in those first weeks, he corrected her with patience rather than anger. And true to his word, he never touched her beyond the occasional accidental brush of hands passing dishes at mealtime, always accompanied by a quick apology. He slept in the barn, even when the nights grew cold and Beatrice knew he would be more comfortable in the cabin. She heard him moving around sometimes in the early morning hours, feeding the animals before she had even risen, working himself to exhaustion day after day. She wondered what drove him, what had made him the kind of man who would spend his hard-earned money to buy a woman just to set her free. One evening in late August, after they had finished supper and were sitting on the porch watching the stars emerge, Beatrice finally asked him, "Why did you do it? Why did you buy me?" Ethan was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I had a sister. Her name was Emily. She was 2 years younger than me, smart as a whip, beautiful, full of life. When I was 20 and she was 18, our parents died of cholera. We had no money, no family to take us in. I tried to find work, tried to keep us fed, but it was not enough. Emily got a job in a saloon to help make ends meet, and I thought that would be fine. I thought I could protect her. His voice grew rough. I was wrong. The saloon owner started making demands, said she owed him money for her room and board. Before I understood what was happening, he had sold her contract to a man heading to San Francisco. I tried to stop it, got into a fight with 3 of the owner's men, and they beat me so badly I was unconscious for 2 days. By the time I could stand again, Emily was gone. I never saw her again. Beatrice felt tears sting her eyes. What happened to her? I do not know. I searched for 5 years. Went to San Francisco, asked questions, followed every lead. But she had disappeared into that world where women vanish and nobody cares enough to look for them. I think she is probably dead. And I think she died believing I abandoned her when she needed me most. That was not your fault, Beatrice said softly. Maybe not, but I could not save her. So when I saw you standing in that street wearing a collar like an animal, I saw Emily. And I knew I could not walk away. I had to at least try to save one person, even if I was too late to save my sister. They sat in silence for a long time after that, 2 damaged people watching the stars wheel slowly across the Wyoming sky. Beatrice felt something shift inside her, a subtle rearrangement of her understanding. Ethan Barrett was not rescuing her to be a hero. He was trying to atone for a failure that was not his fault, trying to make sense of a world that had stolen someone he loved. I am sorry about Emily, Beatrice finally said. I am sorry about whatever happened to make you so afraid of trusting people. It was not one thing, it was 1,000 things. You do not have to tell me unless you want to. But surprisingly, Beatrice found that she did want to tell him. So she did. Sitting there in the darkness where she could not see his face clearly enough to watch his judgment form. She told him about her mother's death, about the saloon owner who had claimed false debts, about being sold the first time to a merchant who had used her brutally, and then tired of her. She told him about the second man, a gambler who had won her in a card game and kept her locked in a room for 6 months. And she told him about Thaddeus Crane, who had seemed civilized on the surface but had been the cruelest of all, a man who had enjoyed breaking her spirit as much as using her body. When she finished, her voice was hoarse and her hands were shaking. But Ethan did not look at her with pity or disgust. He looked at her with respect, as though she had revealed something brave rather than shameful. You survived, he said simply. That takes strength most people do not have. Some days I am not sure survival was worth it, but you are here. You are free of that collar, and tomorrow you can decide what kind of life you want to build. That is worth something, is it not? Beatrice thought about that as she went inside to sleep that night. For the first time since she could remember, she lay down in the bed instead of sitting watch in the chair. She kept the revolver under her pillow, but she allowed herself to close her eyes and drift into something approaching genuine sleep. The weeks turned into months, and a rhythm developed between Beatrice and Ethan. They worked together seamlessly, anticipating each other's needs, dividing tasks without needing to discuss them. She learned the rhythms of ranch life, the way the seasons dictated the work, the way the land demanded attention and care. He taught her to ride better, to shoot accurately, to track deer through the sage. She taught him that food could be more than fuel, creating meals that made him close his eyes with pleasure. They talked in the evenings, sharing stories about their pasts, their dreams for the future. Beatrice learned that Ethan had been a soldier briefly during the Civil War, fighting for the Union until a leg wound sent him home. He had used his army pay and years of hard work to buy this land, building everything with his own hands. His dream was simple: to have a ranch large enough to support a family, to live honestly, to never owe anything to anyone. Beatrice found herself softening toward him in ways that terrified her. She noticed things she had trained herself not to notice. The way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the strength in his hands when he worked, the gentleness in his voice when he talked to the animals. She noticed how he always made sure she ate first, how he left wildflowers on the porch sometimes without saying anything, how he respected every boundary she had set without ever making her feel burdensome. She noticed, and she tried very hard not to care. But caring crept up on her anyway, quiet and insistent as the changing season. By September, when the air grew crisp and the aspen trees turned gold on the distant mountains, Beatrice had to admit to herself that she was developing feelings for Ethan Barrett. It was terrifying. Every man she had ever cared about, even a little, had betrayed that trust. But Ethan kept being exactly who he claimed to be: honest, kind, patient, and utterly without expectations of her beyond the work they had agreed upon. One evening in early October, a storm rolled in suddenly, the way storms did in Wyoming. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour, and rain lashed the ranch in cold sheets. Beatrice was in the cabin preparing supper when lightning struck close enough to rattle the windows. She looked out and saw Ethan in the barn, but she knew the barn roof leaked in several places. He would be soaked and freezing all night. She made a decision. She walked out into the rain, getting drenched immediately, and ran to the barn. Ethan looked up in surprise when she burst through the door, water streaming from her hair and clothes. "What are you doing out here? You will catch your death. So will you. That roof leaks like a sieve and it is going to be near freezing tonight. You need to come inside." "Beatrice, we talked about this. You need your space. I need you not to die of pneumonia because you are too stubborn to come in out of the rain. I am not a child, Ethan. I can handle you sleeping on the floor by the fireplace without falling apart." He looked like he might argue, but another crack of lightning made the decision for him. They ran back to the cabin together, and once inside, Beatrice threw him a blanket. "Get out of those wet clothes before you freeze. I will turn around." She busied herself at the stove, stirring the stew she had been making, listening to the rustle of fabric as Ethan changed into dry clothes. When she turned back around, he was wrapped in the blanket, his wet things hanging by the fireplace to dry. His hair was dripping, and he looked younger somehow, vulnerable in a way she had never seen him. "Thank you," he said quietly. They ate dinner in a silence that was not quite comfortable but not uncomfortable either, just charged with something neither of them knew how to name. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin was warm and dry and filled with the kind of domestic intimacy that Beatrice had never experienced before. This was what safety felt like, she realized. This was what it meant to share space with someone who did not want to hurt you. After dinner, Ethan settled on the floor near the fireplace with his saddle for a pillow. Beatrice lay in the bed, watching the play of firelight on the ceiling, listening to the rain drum against the roof. She knew she should sleep, but her mind would not quiet. She kept thinking about the man lying on the floor, about all the ways he had proven himself different from every other man she had known. "Ethan," she said into the darkness. "Yes. Why have you never married?" He was quiet for a moment. "I came close once before the war. Girl named Sarah who lived on a neighboring farm. But when I came back wounded, she had married someone else. I was angry at first, but looking back, I think she did me a favor. We wanted different things. She wanted comfort and security. I wanted something else, though I did not know what at the time. What do you want now? Partnership, I suppose. Someone to build a life with, not someone to take care of or control. Someone who wants to be there by choice, not because society or economics forces them." Maybe that is asking too much. Beatrice's heart hammered in her chest. I do not think it is asking too much." She heard him shift on the floor. "What do you want, Beatrice?" It was the first time he had asked her that, and she realized no one had ever asked her what she wanted before. "I want to never be owned again. I want to make my own choices, and I want—" She hesitated, afraid to say it out loud. "I want to know what it feels like to be with someone because I choose to be, not because I have no other option." "That makes sense," Ethan said, and she heard the understanding in his voice. "You deserve that. You deserve all of that." The storm blew itself out overnight, and by morning the world was washed clean and bright. Ethan went back to sleeping in the barn, but something had changed between them. The air felt charged with possibility, and Beatrice caught herself watching him more often, wondering what it would be like to touch him not out of obligation but desire. She tried to push the thoughts away. She was not ready. She might never be ready. The damage done to her ran too deep, the scars too permanent. But the thoughts kept coming back, insistent as the turning of the seasons. In late October, 3 men rode onto the Barrett ranch just before sunset. Beatrice was hanging laundry when she saw them approach, and something about their bearing made her instinctively reach for the revolver she now carried in her apron pocket. She walked quickly to where Ethan was repairing fence posts. "We have visitors," she said quietly. "They do not look friendly." Ethan straightened, his face growing serious. "Go inside and bolt the door. Do not come out unless I call for you." "Ethan, please, Beatrice, trust me on this." She wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped her. She went inside but positioned herself at the window where she could see and hear what was happening. Her hand closed around the revolver, and she made sure it was loaded and ready. The 3 men dismounted in the yard. They were rough-looking, the kind of drifters who made their living on the wrong side of the law. The one in front, a man with a scarred face and cruel eyes, looked around the ranch with the assessing gaze of someone evaluating potential loot. "You must be Ethan Barrett," the scarred man said. "I am. What can I do for you gentlemen?" "We hear you bought a woman a few months back in Fort Bridger. Woman with dark hair wearing a collar." "That right." Beatrice's blood ran cold. They had come for her. Somehow, someone had sent them to retrieve what they considered stolen property. "I bought a woman's contract, yes," Ethan said carefully. "What business is that of yours?" Thaddeus Crane's nephew thinks you might have taken advantage of his uncle's death to acquire property that should have gone to the family. He wants the woman returned. Says he will pay you what you spent plus $20 for your trouble. The woman is not for sale. That is not smart, friend. Jackson Crane is not a man you want to cross. I do not care who Jackson Crane is. The woman stays here. The scarred man's hand moved toward his gun. "Maybe you did not hear me right. This is not a negotiation." Ethan's posture shifted subtly, and Beatrice recognized the stance of someone ready for violence. "Get off my land, now. We will leave when we have what we came for." Everything happened very fast after that. The scarred man drew his gun, but Ethan was faster. His shot caught the man in the shoulder, spinning him around. The other 2 men went for their weapons, and Beatrice did not think. She threw open the door and fired twice, her bullets kicking up dirt at the feet of the second man, making him stumble back. "The next one goes through your chest," she shouted, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Drop your guns and ride out, or I swear I will kill you." The 2 uninjured men looked at each other, then at the scarred man clutching his bleeding shoulder, then at Beatrice standing in the doorway with a smoking revolver. Whatever they had expected, it was not this. They dropped their guns, hauled their wounded companion onto his horse, and rode away at a gallop, disappearing into the gathering dusk. Beatrice stood frozen, the revolver shaking in her hands now that the immediate danger had passed. Ethan walked over and gently took the gun from her, setting the safety before handing it back. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I think so. Are you?" "Yes. Thank you for not staying inside like I asked. I could not let them take me, and I could not let them hurt you." Ethan looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. "We should prepare in case they come back with more men. Jackson Crane has money and influence. This is not over." But the men did not come back that night, or the next day, or the day after that. A week later, Ethan rode into Fort Bridger and came back with news. Jackson Crane had been arrested for fraud and embezzlement. Apparently, his uncle's estate was mired in debt and legal troubles, and Crane had been trying to liquidate assets, including humans he considered property, to pay off his creditors. But a federal marshal had been investigating him, and the attempt to reclaim Beatrice had given the marshal the evidence he needed to make an arrest. "It is over," Ethan told Beatrice. "No one is coming for you. You are free, legally and completely. Crane's claim on you never had any validity in the first place. What his uncle did was kidnapping and false imprisonment. The law just did not care enough to prosecute until money was involved." Beatrice sat down heavily, feeling like the ground had shifted under her feet. "So I could leave right now and no one could stop me." "That is right. You could go anywhere, be anyone. The world is open to you." She looked around the cabin at the life she had built here over the past 4 months. It was not the life she would have chosen if she had been given a choice at 18 or 20. But now, at 21, having survived things that would have broken most people, this life felt precious. This simple cabin, this hard work, this quiet companionship with a man who had proven himself worthy of trust, all of it had value she could not have imagined back when she stood in Fort Bridger Street wearing a collar. "What if I do not want to leave?" she asked quietly. Ethan looked at her, and the hope in his eyes was almost painful to see. "Then you could stay, not as an employee anymore, as a partner, as someone building this ranch alongside me. Ethan, I do not know if I can be what you need. I am broken in ways I do not think I can fix." He crossed the room and knelt in front of her, not touching but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "You are not broken. You are scarred, but scars are proof of survival, and I am not asking you to be anything other than who you are. I am not asking you to be ready for things you are not ready for. I am just asking if you would consider staying, building something here, seeing where this goes between us." Beatrice looked into his hazel eyes and saw no pressure, no expectation of reciprocation, just honest affection and infinite patience. She thought about the collar buried deep in the Wyoming earth. She thought about the gun under her pillow that she had not needed to use against him. She thought about the way he said her name like it was something valuable. "I would like to stay," she said, "but slowly. I need to do this slowly." "As slow as you need," Ethan promised. "I have waited this long, I can wait longer." The winter of 1872 was harsh, with snow piling deep and temperatures plunging below zero. Beatrice and Ethan worked together to keep the ranch running, feeding animals, breaking ice on water troughs, keeping the cabin warm. They developed a routine that was domestic and comfortable, and slowly, incrementally, Beatrice allowed herself to get closer to him. She let him hold her hand sometimes in the evenings. She leaned against him when they sat watching the fire. She allowed herself to enjoy the sound of his laughter and the warmth of his smile. And one night in January, when the cold was so intense that even the barn was uninhabitable for sleeping, she invited him to sleep in the cabin without any pretense about storms or necessity. "You can take the bed," she said. "I will sleep in the chair." "We could share," Ethan said carefully. "Just sleep. Nothing else. I would stay on top of the covers if that makes you feel better." "But it is cold, and there is no sense in either of us being uncomfortable when that bed is big enough for two people to sleep respectably. It was a risk. Everything in Beatrice screamed at her that this was how it started, how the boundaries came down, how the bad things happened. But she was tired of being afraid. She was tired of letting her past dictate her future, and more than anything, she trusted Ethan Barrett. "All right," she said. They lay in the bed that night, a careful space between them, both fully clothed. Beatrice was so tense she thought she might shatter, but Ethan did exactly what he had promised. He lay still, his breathing slow and even, making no move toward her. And gradually, as the hours passed and nothing bad happened, Beatrice felt herself relax. She moved closer just slightly and felt the warmth radiating from him. She allowed her hand to rest near his, their fingers almost touching. "Is this all right?" she whispered. "This is perfect," Ethan whispered back, and it was. It was perfect in a way Beatrice had never experienced, this quiet intimacy without pressure, this sharing of space without demands. She fell asleep that way, close enough to touch but not touching, safe enough to rest. After that night, they shared the bed regularly, and Beatrice found herself healing in ways she had not thought possible. Touch became something she could enjoy rather than endure. Closeness became something she could want rather than fear. And slowly, tentatively, she began to imagine a future where intimacy was not just bearable but desired. Spring came to Wyoming with an explosion of wildflowers and new grass, and the ranch felt like it was waking from a long sleep. Beatrice planted a larger garden, putting in seeds for vegetables and herbs, working the soil with her hands and feeling connected to the earth in a way she never had before. Ethan bought more cattle, expanding the herd, talking about his plans for the future as though Beatrice would automatically be part of them. One evening in May, as they watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, Beatrice turned to Ethan and said, "I think I am ready." "Ready for what?" "Ready to be with you. Really be with you. Not because I have to, not because I owe you anything, but because I want to, because I love you." The words hung in the air between them, precious and fragile. Ethan looked at her with wonder, as though she had given him something more valuable than gold. "Are you sure?" he asked. "There is no rush. I can wait as long as you need." "I am sure. I have never been more sure of anything in my life." Ethan stood and held out his hand, and Beatrice took it. They walked inside the cabin together, and for the first time in her life, Beatrice experienced intimacy as something beautiful. Ethan was patient and gentle, constantly checking to make sure she was comfortable, letting her set the pace and the boundaries. And when she cried afterward, he held her and understood that they were tears of release, of grief for everything she had lost and joy for what she had found. "I love you too," he said into her hair. "I have loved you since the day I saw you standing in that street, refusing to let them break your spirit. I will love you for the rest of my life." They were married in Fort Bridger on a bright day in June of 1873, with a few local friends as witnesses. Beatrice wore a simple blue dress that she had sewn herself, and Ethan wore his best suit, which was still worn and patched but clean. The ceremony was brief and the celebration modest, but when Beatrice said her vows, she meant every word. She was choosing this man, this life, this future, and that choice felt like reclaiming herself. Their life together was not easy. The ranch demanded constant work, and there were hard years when the cattle prices dropped or the weather was bad. But they faced everything together, partners in the truest sense. Beatrice discovered she had a talent for managing the ranch's finances, keeping meticulous records and making smart decisions about when to buy and sell. Ethan discovered that having someone to share the burden made even the hardest work bearable. In the spring of 1875, Beatrice realized she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with a complex mixture of joy and terror. She had never thought she would have children, had never believed she would find someone she trusted enough to create a family with. But as her belly grew and Ethan fussed over her with protective concern, she found herself excited about the future in a way she had never allowed herself to be. Their son was born in December of 1875, a healthy baby boy with Ethan's hazel eyes and Beatrice's dark hair. They named him Samuel, after Ethan's father, and Beatrice fell in love with her child in a way that was almost painful. Holding Samuel, she understood viscerally what it meant to want to protect someone, to give everything you had to ensure their safety and happiness. Ethan was a devoted father, taking turns walking Samuel when he cried at night, changing diapers without complaint, talking to the baby in a soft voice that made Beatrice's heart ache with love. Watching him with their son, she marveled at how different he was from every man she had known before. His strength was in his gentleness, his power in his restraint. 2 years later, in 1877, their daughter arrived, a tiny girl they named Elizabeth after Ethan's sister Emily. She looked like a miniature version of Beatrice, with the same blue eyes and stubborn chin. Samuel was a doting older brother, carefully bringing his baby sister toys and patting her head with 2-year-old enthusiasm. The Barrett ranch grew over the years, becoming more prosperous as Ethan and Beatrice's hard work paid off. They hired hands to help with the cattle, but they never forgot what it felt like to struggle. They paid fair wages and treated their workers with respect, and in return, they earned loyalty and dedication. In 1880, when Beatrice was 29 and Ethan was 34, they finally had the money to build a larger house, a proper 2-story structure with bedrooms for the children and a kitchen that was not cramped and dark. But before the builders started work, Ethan took Beatrice out to the place where he had buried her collar 8 years earlier. "I want to build the new house right here," he said. "Right over the place where we buried the worst part of your past. So every day when you walk through your home, you are literally standing on ground that represents your freedom and your choice." Beatrice looked at him with tears in her eyes. After 8 years of marriage, he could still surprise her with gestures that showed how deeply he understood her. "That is perfect," she said. "Let us build our future exactly there." The house went up over the summer of 1880, a beautiful structure with glass windows that let in light and a wide porch perfect for watching Wyoming's dramatic sunsets. The children ran through the rooms, their laughter echoing off the walls, and Beatrice thought about the girl who had stood in Fort Bridger Street wearing a collar, believing she had no future worth living. That girl could never have imagined this life, this joy, this profound sense of belonging. In 1883, they had another son, a sturdy boy they named Thomas, who inherited his mother's fierce independence and his father's patient temperament. Their family felt complete. 3 children who would grow up knowing they were loved and wanted, who would never experience the helplessness and degradation their mother had endured. As the years passed, Beatrice became a respected figure in Fort Bridger and the surrounding ranches. She helped other women when she could, offering work to those who needed it, standing up against men who thought money gave them ownership. She never talked publicly about her own past, but people knew, the way people always knew things in small communities. And rather than looking down on her, they respected her resilience and her refusal to be defined by what had been done to her. Ethan's hair started going gray at the temples in his late 30s, and Beatrice discovered her own silver threads in her early 30s. They laughed about growing old together, about the lines forming on their faces from years of hard work and laughter. Samuel grew into a tall, serious young man who wanted to study law. Elizabeth was bright and curious, always asking questions, always wanting to understand how things worked. Thomas was the ranch hand of the family, happiest when he was working with the horses and cattle. In the summer of 1890, Samuel left for university back east, determined to become a lawyer who fought for people who could not fight for themselves. Beatrice cried as she watched him board the train, but they were proud tears. Her son would do good work in the world. He had been raised by parents who understood the importance of justice and compassion. Elizabeth followed 4 years later, heading to a women's college in Colorado to study medicine. Thomas stayed on the ranch, taking over more of the daily operations as Ethan's joints began to ache from decades of hard physical labor. The ranch continued to prosper, and in 1895, Thomas married a sensible young woman named Margaret who loved the ranching life as much as he did. Beatrice and Ethan became grandparents in 1896, when Thomas and Margaret had a daughter named Rose. Holding her first grandchild, Beatrice marveled at the impossible distance she had traveled from that terrible day in Fort Bridger 24 years earlier. The baby in her arms was free, loved, wanted, and protected. That was legacy. That was victory. They celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary in 1898 with all 3 children home, along with their spouses and growing families. Samuel had married a fellow lawyer and had twin boys. Elizabeth had married a doctor and had a daughter. Thomas and Margaret were expecting their second child. The house rang with noise and laughter, 3 generations of Barretts filling the space with life and love. That night, after everyone had gone to bed and the house was finally quiet, Beatrice and Ethan sat on the porch they had sat on countless times before. She leaned against him, his arm around her shoulders, and looked out at the land they had built together. "You remember the day you cut off that collar?" she asked. "Every detail," Ethan said. "I remember thinking you were the bravest person I had ever seen, standing there terrified but refusing to break. I remember thinking you were probably lying, that you would turn out to be just like the others. What made you decide to trust me? You buried the collar deep. You did not just throw it away. You buried it like it was something evil that needed to be put down permanently. That was when I started to believe you might actually be different." Ethan pulled her closer. "Best $100 I ever spent. I was never worth $100. You were worth everything I had. You still are." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one across the vast Wyoming sky. Beatrice thought about the girl she had been and the woman she had become. The journey between those 2 versions of herself had been long and painful, but it had also been worth it. She had survived. She had healed. She had loved and been loved in return. She had built a family and a legacy that would outlast her. The collar that Thaddeus Crane had welded around her neck was still buried somewhere beneath the foundation of their house, buried deep in the Wyoming earth where it could never hurt anyone again. And every day, Beatrice walked over that spot, stood over that symbol of her past bondage, and lived a life defined not by what had been done to her, but by what she had chosen to become. She had been owned, but she had become free. She had been broken, but she had healed. She had been alone, but she had found partnership. And through it all, Ethan Barrett had stood beside her, not as her savior, but as her partner, not as her owner, but as her equal, not demanding her love, but earning it day by day, year by year, through patience and kindness and unwavering respect. "I love you," Beatrice said, the words as true in 1898 as they had been in 1873 when she first spoke them. "I love you too," Ethan replied, "for the rest of my life and whatever comes after." And there, on the porch of the house built over buried chains, surrounded by the family they had created and the life they had chosen, Beatrice Parker Barrett was finally completely, irrevocably free. The cowboy had cut off her collar and buried it deep, but what he had really given her was something far more valuable: the chance to discover who she could be when she was no longer defined by what men had made her. And she had become someone extraordinary, not despite her scars but because of them, not in spite of her past but informed by it, shaped by it, and ultimately transcendent over it. Their love story was not about rescue. It was about partnership, about two damaged people choosing to build something beautiful together. And as the Wyoming stars wheeled overhead and the night settled in around them, Beatrice knew that this, all of this, every moment of joy and struggle and triumph, was exactly the life she would choose again if given the chance. She had been owned, but she had reclaimed herself. She had worn a collar, but she had broken free. And in the end, that freedom, built on love and respect and mutual choice, was worth more than all the gold in the territories.